Thanks for joining us today. This is the Inflectra webinar focusing on the new SpiraApps functionality in the Spira 7.0 release. And we also have a few other things we'll be talking about in the 7.0 release as well as SpiraApps, but the core functionality and the main feature for today's presentation is going to be on SpiraApps. Spira 7.0 was released a few weeks ago, both for cloud and on-premise customers, and it's available for all three flavors of Spira: Spira Test, Spira Team, and Spira Plan. Or where possible, I will try and outline which particular features are specific to each version. And if you have any questions, please write them in the Q&A window, and my colleague Teresa will be moderating those, and we'll be reading them out at the end. So during the presentation, feel free to write at any time. We will be doing them at the end, but if you see something as we're presenting, just write it down. No need to wait. All right, with that, let's get started. So first of all, we'll be doing a little overview of Spira 7.0. The two main areas of functionality we'll be talking about will be, firstly, SpiraApps, which is the new plugin architecture we have in the Spira platform. We'll be going through some of the different types of plugins that we have. After we do that, we're then going to be looking at one of the other major features, which was the UI enhancements to the data synchronization functionality, which is an existing integration framework we have for sharing information between different products like Jira and Microsoft Azure DevOps. And since we were working on the plugin architecture, it made sense to also improve our existing integrations as well. After we go through this overview section, I'll be handing off to Simon, who will be giving a live application demo of these plugins and the data sync enhancements. And after that, we'll move into the Q&A session. So with that, let's start out with SpiraApps. So first of all, what are SpiraApps? Well, SpiraApps are basically a way for us to release plugin functionality in the Spira Test Team and Plan platform that lets you have functionality that you can turn on as an administrator to provide features and integrations that might be unique or needed by your company. Previously, if you wanted to have an integration, it required something like a plugin for data synchronization or remote launch, some external tool. And with the rise of more and more cloud-based products and SaaS platforms, increasingly it makes more sense to have the integration be natively in the web, so you can just go into Spira, push a button, and be able to launch something or integrate with something. The other major benefit is from a usability standpoint is you can now have within Spira buttons and menus and toolbars and other features that actually look like they're natively part of Spira, but they actually are extensions. So that lets us release functionality to do these integrations that will appear natively inside of Spira, but they're available as plugins, so we can release them outside of the main release cycle. And it also lets us have these functionality be available, and you as an administrator have control from a user experience standpoint as to which plugins are available to your users. When we get into this a little bit later on, you'll see we have different plugins, for example, for CI tools. We don't know which ones you want to use, so you have the ability now to turn those on as you need. Also, there are some automations and features where we want to provide shortcuts or ways to do things more quickly, where this is functionality that is needed by some customers, but not by all. And so rather than cluttering up the main user interface with lots and lots of options and buttons, we can deliver these now as plugins where you can have functionality that you as a user might want in your project, but someone else doesn't want. And so that way it lets you tailor the user experience with these new apps as you need. So those are some of the main driving forces behind the plugin architecture. The longer-term vision is also that our partners and customers and other third-party developers will be able to release their own apps for Spira, so that way they can extend the functionality without relying on Inflectra to build them all. That way we can have features that third parties are able to build. Especially this is useful where we have maybe a third-party product that maybe only a small number of customers need, and we don't have the time to build it ourselves. A customer or partner could then choose to build it themselves as well. So it really opens up the entire Spira platform to different developers and vendors to be able to extend it. One of the things I should emphasize, though, is that this does not change our core philosophy. One of the core philosophies of Spira is that it should be a complete product. Unlike some other tools in the market, it doesn't require 100 plugins to be useful. We don't see the plugin architecture replacing core functionality. We want Spira to have its core functionality be such that you don't need to buy a whole bunch of plugins to make it useful and cover the full life cycle. So SpiraApps is not meant to replace that. It's purely for smaller features, niche features, or integrations where it makes sense to be delivered as a plugin. So with that being said, with the new version 7, when you go into the system administration section, you will see all the different plugins that are available in the system. Currently, those are loaded with the system. So when you get Spira 7, you will see these list of plugins. When we go to 7.1 or 7.2, you will see this list increase. Eventually, we're going to have the ability to pull plugins in addition from a marketplace and from a third-party store, like a store. That isn't available yet. So in the current version, and if you were to use it today, you'll only see the plugins that are specific to your major version number. But the plan is to allow you to have out-of-band updates in the future as well. When you come into this, you'll be able to see all the plugins, and you'll be able to activate the plugins for your particular installation of Spira. My colleague will talk more about this in the live demo. But when you do that, this then enables the different project owners and project admins to be able to enable that plugin for their project. So it's a two-step process. The system admin will enable it for their installation, for their instance. And then the project owners can then opt to include that plugin, that app, to be available in their specific project. So that way, it doesn't have to be available for everyone in the company if that doesn't make sense, especially if one team is using, say, we'll get this later, GitLab, or one other team is using Circle CI. You could see why you'd want to have different teams having the ability to opt into different apps. But if the system admin has not enabled it, you can't use that plugin. So it does require an initial company-wide opt-in. Okay, once you do that, each of the different plugins will have its own unique set of settings. And when we go through the application, we'll talk more about those. But there are settings you'll have to configure. Some of those settings might be at the system level, like authentication information. Some settings might be at the project level, and you can do that as well. So depending on the plugin, there may be product and system-wide settings. Once you've turned that on, then your individual users in that product can then use those features. So I'm going to outline some of the key integrations and some of the key apps we've released. Again, we'll go through this more in detail when we go into the live application demo. The first class are the CI/CD integrations. We've released 3: GitLab, pipelines, GitHub, Actions, and Circle CI pipelines. We already have integration with these tools already for code management using Git and for issue tracking using our data synchronization framework. This is in addition to that. This lets you launch pipelines or actions from the natively within the Spira interface using a button like you can see on the screen. It also lets you receive the results back of those builds and information using a webhook. And so when a build comes back from GitLab, when it runs, it will come back into Spira in the build section as you would see normally. And right now we have, as I mentioned, plugins for GitLab, GitHub, and Circle CI. Currently, we do have older integrations that were written for Microsoft Azure DevOps, Jenkins, and TeamCity. Those are written using the plugin architecture of those platforms. There is not currently a button in Spira to launch Jenkins, ADO, or TeamCity. If that's something of interest, we could certainly add that, particularly for Jenkins when it's in the cloud using something like CloudBees. There's some interest from some of our customers about that type of integration. Right now, we really are focused on the top three as being cloud-based, and the bottom 3 are existing older integration architectures. So those are some of the integrations. Now, we've also released some functionality within Spira to highlight that the SpiraApps framework is not just for integrations, it's also for automating common tasks and adding productivity improvements. The first one is what we call preset tasks and preset test cases. And this is a very common need, particularly in a software development project. You have what are called steps to doneness, which is a horrible word, doneness. It's not necessarily a real word, but steps to doneness. If you've ever gone through a project, you will document as a team your steps to doneness, which might be design the module, write the code, do a code review, do some integration testing, unit testing, do performance test, security test. Might include deployment staging, maybe a third-party stakeholder review, whatever it is. There's a series of steps we've done this, and I remember at my old company, Sapient, they used to, shout out to them, they used to have drink beer as the final task, so you could have that. So the idea is you've got these standard tasks that every requirement and user story should go through. Well, right now, that's a bit of a pain in Spira. You have to write it once and clone the requirement. With this new feature, you can basically define a set of standard tasks and optionally specify the type of task, and that can then be added to a requirement or release as a standard set of items, like a checklist. So you can define your steps of doneness, which could be both tasks, if they're like developer tasks or management tasks, but they could be standard test cases. You might decide that every requirement has to have a unit test, functional test, load test, and security test. And that could be your standard and an acceptance test. And that could be your standard process. You can now define as a standard or preset test cases. And we do support this both on the requirement level and on the release level. Release level is more commonly going to be used for like a final release checklist. It could be a place where you do your final release verification before you go live, or a post-release checklist. And the test cases could be a final regression suite that gets run against that release. for example. So there's, again, lots of different uses for this, but these are some, again, good productivity improvement that lets you repeat these tasks very easily without having to clone everything. Once you create those tests or tasks, they will appear like this, and you can use that drop dialog to basically just pick a checklist and it will get created. And we'll see this later live in the application. The other great productivity improvement is default descriptions. This lets you take any of the artifacts and define a default description. So for example, if you're logging a new defect, it's quite common to want to have like a template that someone fills in, or if it's a new requirement, maybe there's a standard template for that requirement. You can now define a standard default description. So whenever that artifact gets created in the project, it will automatically take on that default description. And it just uses the standard rich text editor we have in Spira. And then the last of our plugins is a little bit more sophisticated. This is to address a need we've seen in some hardware projects, particularly in life sciences, manufacturing, supply chain, where you want to do risk management. And this is a Spira plan only feature. This is one where you've got risk management in Spira. You've got your risks, they've got probability, they've got impact, they've got exposure. Or sometimes you want to calculate what's called a risk priority number. That's where you take a third value, the detectability, and you multiply that by the probability and the impact to give this RPN value. And that's very useful in hardware systems where detectability and whether something is easy to see or hard to see plays a role in how dangerous the risk is. And so in that situation, when you turn on this field, this plugin, you've now got the extra field. You've now got a calculated custom property, the RPN number, which you can see on the list page or on the detail page. And even so, even beyond that, we've got a great new feature where you can actually have a custom widget which gets added to the dashboards. So when you turn on this plugin in the SpiraApps, you will have the ability to actually add this risk priority number widget to your product homepage or to your reports homepage. And again, as we add more plugins and apps in the future, we can add more plugins and widgets to the various dashboards. So that's an overview of the SpiraApps functionality specifically. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the other major enhancement from a usability standpoint. And if you remember, data synchronization is where you set up integration between Spira and things like Jira, Azure DevOps, things like Asana. We're also going to be adding integrations in the future with Monday.com and ClickUp. We also have integration with the bug tracking portions of GitHub and GitLab. So it's a very useful framework. It's used for a lot of data integration with lots of different tools. One of the challenges being the setup and configuration for the admins can be a little confusing because previously it was very generic. If you're setting up Azure DevOps or setting up Jira, the screens look the same. There was no real help to set each of them up separately. So now we've added built-in inline help and assistance that makes the setup much easier. You'll notice a difference right away when you go to the main data synchronization homepage. You'll see we've now got icons for the various plugins. You can see them here, right here on the left-hand side of the column. And that shows you that we know that's the Jira versus the Azure DevOps. But more importantly, when you click on the edit button for each of the plugins, we've got two here to compare. You can see that when you go to Jira, and this is actually a Jira Cloud, we also have Jira Server with a different one. You can see that the different fields on the left-hand side are now specific to the plugin. It says Jira UL, it says API key, it doesn't say password. It says severity field, not custom one. It says task types, not custom two. On the Azure DevOps side, same thing, password or personal access token, it says now. It's got help descriptions. It's also got placeholders, which is basically samples of what the text should look like. So that way, when you're setting this all up, it's much easier. You don't have to alt-tab between this and the documentation. The documentation is now in the tool. We've also added a handy link from each of these pages to the appropriate part of our documentation set as well. You can't see it here on the page. It was cropped out, but you can click on a question mark icon and it will take you to our documentation site specifically for your plugin. This is all to make the setup and management just much easier. So that's some of these apps that we've shipped today, or we're going into the live application in a minute to see them in action. Before we do that, just thought I'd mention some future plans that we have. These are just the future plans with SpiraApps. I should be very clear. There's a whole bunch of other stuff on our roadmap for Spira as a whole. Go to our roadmap, have a look. The plugin that's coming next is going to be the Octoperf Spira app. Well, that will let you launch Octoperf load tests directly from the Spira UI. That's coming in version 7.1. Beyond that, we've got some other integrations, things around integrating with crowdsourced testing tools. We've got a partnership with a company there that does that well, and we're going to be adding hopefully a plugin for that. There's another tool that does requirements AI analysis and puts those results back into Spira. We're looking at that. There's some other DevOps tools and platforms. We've done the major ones, but there are some specific ones for different technologies like Salesforce or ServiceNow or SAP, where it may make sense to have orchestration integration. There's other collaboration tools we're looking at, things like Slack, to see if that makes sense to be an app. And then there's other types of in-app productivity. We've talked about the preset tasks and test cases and the descriptions. Two other items that have come up would be auto-assignment of artifacts, so that depending on which component you choose or which other value you choose, we could assign the items automatically based on rules. And also the ability to do multi-person approvals of artifacts is another app we're looking at adding. Again, don't set the CDs in stone. This is not set in stone. These are just some ideas we have. The only one that's guaranteed right now is the Octoperf. If you have specific ideas or feedback, let us know. Either you can write it in the chat, the Q&A, or you can message us after the webinar as well. Always interested in your feedback. And so with that, I'm now going to hand it over to Simor Bor, our head of products, who's going to be going through the live application demo. Take it away, Simon.
Thanks so much, Adam. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I get to do the exciting part of sharing all the great new features that Adam talked about in the tool itself. I'll go through the data synchronization first. Just to be brief, Adam showed virtually all of it and more from those screenshots alone. There's not much more to it. And then I'll talk about SpiraApps and go through each of the main ones that Adam highlighted. So here we are on the system admin data synchronization page. It's this page right here. And you can see that we have all these new icons to really make it very visually easy to see exactly what product the data sync is about. So here's the Jira one with the Jira icon. And if we click the edit button, just like we saw in the screenshots, it loads up with this bespoke information telling you exactly what you need to do, including with these helpful tooltips and this explainer text, as well as this placeholder text, to give you as much information as possible to help you really work out how to complete this part of the data synchronization really easily. Like Adam said, there's a help button at the top, which goes straight to the relevant documentation page in our Spira Docs site. But with these new changes, it may be that many of you won't even need anymore to open that documentation, at least for filling in this part of the setup for the data sync. Like we saw, this is different for every one of these plugins. It has the unique setup that we need for each of these that's specific to each of those systems. So that's data sync. So let's now move on to SpiraApps. I'm going to start here how you get to it. This is on the system admin home. I'm going to jump between administration and the application itself. It's under the system section, SpiraApps. It loads up this page, and you can see I've got the 7 or so SpiraApps we released with version 7. And there's a very simple activate, deactivate button here. And you can see I've got 4 active now. These are the 4 I'm going to talk through in more detail. And there's a settings page. Only actually the CEI/CD SpiraApps right now have any system level settings. And that's really where you'd set up your, it's just for putting in your credentials. So I won't show those now because I do have live credentials in there. The others currently don't, but they have other settings we have to do. So this is the system level. You can turn them on at the system level. If you turn something off at the system level, no one in any product will be able to use that Spira app. If you've enabled it at the system level, any product admin can turn it on for any one of their products. So let's go to this product here. I'm in this product called Clinical Medical Devices. You can see I've got these 4 that I've turned on at the system level are now available to me at the product level. I'm going to enable this one first, the default descriptions. And if we go into the settings here, we can see how you set up this page. And these settings, the way they're laid out, what options are available, differ for every Spira app, and there's lots of functionality that different Spira apps can give people when they're developing, when we're initially and others in the future are developing Spira apps. So here I've just put in some dummy text showing a range of different features. So we've got some rich text for this requirement description and some rich text with some highlights and a table for this test case description. You can put links. This is a link to, I think, google.com. You can put tables, you can put code, you can embed YouTube links. The only thing you can't put in, you can't embed screenshots in here. You can link to other images as allowed, but you can't paste images into here. But otherwise, you have the full functionality of a rich text editor. So how does this work in practice? You as an admin have set this up. You've saved these settings. So I've turned it on. Now let's actually create a new requirement. So I'm going to load this page again now that I've turned on the Spira app. And how the Spira takes effect, because it's a default description, is when you make a new requirement. So when I hit this new button, and now don't think of me as an admin, I'm just a regular user. Any user on any of your teams, when they hit this add button, you can see immediately I've got this default description populated for me right here. As an end user, I don't have to think about a Spira app. It's completely invisible to me. The admin set it up. I'm then just using the tool as I always would. And suddenly I've got this rich template here for completing my new requirement. And I can delete it. I can make any changes to it I like. I can delete whole sections. That's completely fine. And I can save my page as normal. And oh yeah, I didn't give it a name. I got carried away with the description. And you can see that after I've done this, I can change whatever I want the description. It just gives you that default description from the very beginning. So that's requirements. Let's try that again for a test case. Again, I'm on a test case. Just hit new. Again, nothing special. And you can see that the description wasn't populated. Let me go back and check my settings here. Okay, a temporary glitch with test cases. You can see it works with requirements and all the artifacts. I won't get into the issue of test cases now. But this works, like I said, for all of these artifacts, risks, tasks, incidents, releases, and requirements. So let's now take a look at another Spira app. I'm going to take a look at this task and test presets. So I'll enable this one, and I'll just go into the settings. And like Adam talked about, you can use this for a variety of use cases. You can use this for, I've got one here for an example for multi-approvers. As Adam said, maybe we'll develop a more rich Spira app for dealing with this in the future. Another one for getting your code ready for, your feature ready for completion. Have these, as Adam said, done this, I just call them code complete tasks. And you can put in a comma-separated list of names for your tasks, or here, names for your test cases. So now that I've turned that on, let's see what that looks like in reality. So I'm going to go back to this one and reload this page. And you'll see now I get this new button at the top here called Create Presets. Again, as an end user, I don't know that Create Presets is a Spira app and Delete is not. It's just here. And for me, it's just a native part of the UI. So I click on this drop down and I want to add some tasks to this showcase. And I get this pop-up in the middle of the page. Feels very like a normal pop-up you'd see for built-in functionality to the tool. In this drop down, I have those two different tasks preset lists that I set. I'm going to hit code complete here, hit create. You can see I get this notification telling me it's going to create 4. The 4 are now created. And now you can see I have these 4 development tasks created automatically for me. So I can try that again, and now I'm going to make some test cases. It's the same thing. Hit the test case button. I've only got one preset here just to create some examples. It says the 3 are being created. I go to the tab, and here we have the 3 test cases that I'd predefined are automatically added. They're obviously linked up to the requirements, and they also get any release coverage that this release would have. So if I click on this test case, you can see that it will have requirement coverage and release coverage. So here's the requirement that we link to, and this is the release of that requirement. So now it's very similar than if you created a test case directly from that requirement. So this is a really neat way of quickly generating. Here it's been a handful, 2, 3, or 4. If you wanted to create 10, there's no limit on it. And you can create as many of those lists for those requirements as you wanted to. So you can have a range of different scenarios that you allow your team to use. again, these are all configured at the product level. So every product can set up their own presets that they need for whatever specific case they require. So that was task and test presets. I'm going to go on to the third one. This is a little bit more of a complicated one, and this is FMEA. So I'm just going to enable that here and then go over to my separate set of tabs. Now for FMEA, there's actually, how it works is it integrates with the template. So when you fill in various custom properties for your risk, that will the system will understand that, and the SpiraApp will take that data and use it to work out this RPM, this risk priority number. So the first stage of this is defining a list of detectabilities. Like we already have a list for risks for our workflow, for our probabilities and impacts, we need to define one for detectabilities, because that's the additional measure that when you're using FMEA, you use. So here I have a list of detectabilities. Now I need to go and set up my risk custom properties. And we just need two custom properties, one called detectability, and you can see I've linked it to this detectabilities dropdown, so that just like probability and impact, there'll now be a detectabilities dropdown where I can select the relevant value. And here we have the RPM, this is the risk priority number. This is the field that SpiraApps populates with the data for that risk priority number. And we don't actually, the user should not be changing this themselves. This is something that we auto populate for you by using the detectability, probability, and impact. So if we look at the settings at the product level for the FMEA SpiraApp, you can see there's a number of different settings here. And this is so that the SpiraApp knows exactly what custom properties and what values to use when it's working, because you can set it up however you like on the back end. You just have to tell there's a list custom property called detectability, and here you can see all the options. These are the only custom properties we have for this product for risks, and I want the detectability dropdown to be detectability, and I want to store the RPM in the RPM dropdown. That's what I need to define the calculation of the RPM. The second box here called RPM thresholds is used for that widget that Adam talked about near the end, and it shows these two values here are used for saying what should show as red, what should show as yellow, what should show as green. So hopefully if I've worked out these numbers correctly, when I show you the widget, you'll see a nice red, yellow, and green. So let's now go and take a look at our risks. We've got this set up. We're on this page. Let me just refresh to make sure it's got all those changes. And I've just got 4 risks here. They have a probability and impact and this detectability field. I'm just going to fill in these detectabilities here. So I put in 5. You can see the exposure is 9, which is probability multiplied by impact. I then times that by 5, or the SpiraApp does, to reach a final value of 45. So 9 for the exposure times the detectability value, which is 5 at the beginning of this list item, gives you the RPM. So let's go to another risk and try that again. Let's have this one at 4. So this should now give us a number of 32 for RPM. Let's go down the list, give this one 2. They should get one of 12, and you can see the RPM automatically gets updated to 12, and this one will put 1. So it's very, very easy to detect, and that gets an RPM of 4. And every time we make a change here, I'm now going to change it to 2. You can see it gets updated, and if I move this one to possible, you can see it gets updated again. So anytime we make changes here, it's always updating the RPM in the background for us. So we can always rely on this field to accurately reflect the correct RPM. Let's see what this looks like on the homepage. Here I am on the product homepage. I've got a very basic layout here just with risks showing. This is our normal top open risks widget. I'm going to add the new top open risks widget, and it's in the SpiraApps section. and it's called Top Open Risks by Priority Number. I'm going to add it right above our normal top open risks. Let me just refresh the page. And you can see here we have those 4 risks in descending order of risk priority number, and it's got that red, yellow, and green color. And if in real life you're probably only using FMEA, RPN, or not, so what you'd probably do is hide this widget and just use the top open risks by risk priority number. And here, this basically is a full-on replacement for that widget, that normal top open risk widget, if you want to use FMEA for a particular product. So that's FMEA. Let me now go to the final Spira app I want to show you. And that's one of the CI/CD integrations that Adam started off talking about. Here we are on the product admin homepage, which has these useful widgets showing you information about your product, including about SpiraApps. And if I click on this, it's going to take me to that page we've been looking at before. And it shows in this product, I'm in a different product now. That's why none of these other SpiraApps are enabled. GitHub has been enabled here. I'm going to click here to show you the settings. There's just one very simple setting, which is to link up to GitHub, the repository in GitHub that you want to use for these GitHub actions. To get this fully working, there's also some settings inside GitHub itself. I'm not going to show you those. It's outlined in a lot of detail in our documentation. So the thing I did forget to show you is there are also for this one release custom properties. So let me just open that for you now. Here you can see I've got ones for several different CI/CDs. These are the top are for GitHub, and these are just plain text. But what's very important here, unlike for risks, where we let you type whatever you wanted for the name and hook it up in the Spira app product settings, when you set up these custom properties, you have to use this exact right name here. Again, this is all in the documentation. But once you set up these 2 custom properties, you're then ready to start using the integration. And these have these particular developer or computer-friendly names, because the computer, ultimately the code that has to read these properties and communicate to GitHub about these values. So as we saw for the product settings for the Spira app, we gave it a GitHub repository. And here we give it a branch name. So we've set our repository. In that repository, we want to look at the main branch. That's what we fill in this field. And this field, this is where we say what specific workflow, what specific GitHub action workflow we want to kick off when that is tied to this release or sprint. So you can see at the top here I have a GitHub button. So when I hit run action, it's going to take that information of the repository name, the branch name, and the workflow ID, send that to GitHub, and put in the request to GitHub to start that GitHub pipeline. You can see that GitHub pipeline has been successfully started. And that, when it completes, will show up in the list of builds here at the bottom. Now, it can take a while because builds can be from a few seconds to a few minutes or longer. So I'll just refresh this a couple more times, and you can see I've already got my successful GitHub pipeline, GitHub action, reported correctly straight back into Spira. So as an end user, I've actually, rather than having to log into GitHub or another, maybe perhaps complicated build server setup, as an end user who can work with releases, I can just click this button, start the new action running, and automatically get the build reported back. So that's the end of my demo. Let me now hand over, I think, for any questions to Teresa.
Thanks, Simon.
Hi, yeah, great presentation, both Adam and Simon. We do have a number of questions with some nuances about the way that this new functionality works. So first, let's address this one from Mike Rolls. He was asking, is the preset tasks feature supported by Spira Team?
Yes, the preset tasks feature is supported by Spira Team. It would, but not Spira Test. So you would need Spira Team or Spira Plan to use preset tasks.
Fantastic. The next question comes from Remco, and he's asking about that functionality where you can create test cases directly from a requirement. What happens to the description if you have default test case descriptions set up for test cases in that scenario?
My understanding, and Simon, correct me if I'm wrong, is that if you're using the create test case from requirement, it's going to continue to use the requirement description as it does today. It won't use the default description. The default description is only used when you create a new test case from the test case only page versus from some other artifact. Okay, good.
Fantastic. And then we have another one with kind of a nuance here from Hugo. He's asking, if I preset a test case that already exists in the product, will it have the previously defined steps?
No, if you use the preset task or test case feature, it will always create, if you said I want to create 5 test cases or 5 tasks, it's going to create 5 new test cases or 5 new tasks, and they will have a default step, whatever is defined. It won't reuse an existing one with the same name. It's going to create new ones each time.
Excellent. Another question here from Mike Rolls, I think, and this was at the beginning of the presentation, and he asks, is the REST interface still maintained?
Yeah, the existing REST and SOAP APIs that we have in Spira are still maintained. And in fact, they are being used behind the scenes for SpiraApps. SpiraApps does not replace them. SpiraApps is an in-app framework. When actually it updates things within Spira, it's actually using our standard REST API. So that way, when we do open up the SpiraApps infrastructure to third-party developers, they will be able to use their familiar REST calls that they use today. The SpiraApps infrastructure just takes care of some of the fiddly parts like authentication and credentials management and setting management that we'd have to do somewhere else. But it is built on top of the REST API. It is not actually a replacement for it in any shape or form.
Fantastic. So we have another question here from Vladimir Plotkin, and he asks, is it possible to reverse the FMEA calculation so that the highest number would represent the highest risk?
The RPN number is calculated by multiplying the value times the exposure value. So no, it has to be the largest value. The label and the value number can be, you can decide what you want to call it. But because we're using the built-in exposure, which by its design in the built-in system has the higher numbers being the worst, it has to use that because otherwise it would not work with the two existing fields. So no, it has to be the biggest number in the detectability corresponds to the worst risk.
Thank you, Adam. Just another question here. That was also addressed early in the presentation. I think you've addressed it, but Walter asks, will you be providing an Azure DevOps Spira app?
That's a great question. There's 2 parts to these CI integrations. There's effectively how we launch it and how we get the results back. We added webhooks for GitLab, GitHub, and CI because they don't actually support plugins that we need. Whereas for ADO, we already have a plugin that sits in the pipeline and it reports back. Now, the one thing we could add as a Spira app would be a icon or graphic or a little button that would drop down and say start ADO pipeline, and that would call the REST API of ADO. That is something that we certainly could do. I think I'd mentioned that we could do, in fact, I think I mentioned on that further ideas, that was one of the ideas we had, is to do that. Similarly for Jenkins or TeamCity, where we already have an integration, we could further enhance them with an icon. The main thing we'll need to do is make sure that there's an API that we can access. In the case of Jenkins, it may be only for those that are cloud hosted. So in which case it might end up being effectively a Cloud Bees or Cloud Jenkins integration rather than a general Jenkins one. So we're doing some research on some of that subtle nuances about how best to make it happen. But certainly Azure DevOps is cloud-based, so that will be an easier one than the other two. And that could certainly be something we add. And if you have a request for it, let us know, we'll vote for it, and we will prioritize it in our backlog.
Thank you, Adam. So here's another question. Looks like someone is anxious to get their hands on this functionality. So Frank Volker asks, when approximately will SpiraApps functionality be open to developers?
That one I'm going to hand over to Simon, because otherwise I'm probably going to get shot.
Yeah, there's a number of steps that we have to take before we're ready to open it up. I'm really excited that 7.0 does have SpiraApps released in the wild for people to use and for you to get your hands on and start working with. But right now it's just too early on to feel it's locked down enough in terms of how third parties would develop new SpiraApps for us to feel comfortable releasing it yet. So I think my answer has to be, I don't know yet. It's not going to be in the next few months. There's a a lot of internal work we have to do behind the scenes to make sure that we're fully comfortable that it's both not that it needs to be a good experience to end users, of course. It needs to be a secure end user experience. We also need to work out distribution. We also need to work out the developer experience. Right now, it's fine for our team internally to be developing these, but we have different tools that third parties wouldn't have access to. So we have a number of quite big hurdles to work through before we can start releasing them. I would think the next major step you'd see from us is we may have them once they're separated out from the upgrade itself. So once you can upgrade a Spira app off cycle, as Adam was talking about, that's a key milestone for us to reach. And the next milestone after that would be third parties being able to do the same. But we're still quite a long way from that first milestone even.
Thank you, that's great.
Yeah, thanks so much, Simon. One question to wrap back around to the REST question. Mike asks, does REST actions trigger Spira API? Example is adding auto-generated test cases from third party. Does adding through REST trigger the Spira API? Sorry.
Oh, I understand.
Yeah.
Currently, no. Currently, the particular plugins that we've written here are specifically UI level. So when you're choosing that drop down to create tasks, it triggers JavaScript in the page. It's then calling our REST API behind the scenes, and then when it's finished, it then reloads the page data, so it knows that it's there. It's not, if that page wasn't up and you call our REST API, it isn't going to trigger a third party. Is something that is on our backlog by means of us adding outbound webhooks. We've added inbound webhooks to support CircleCI, GitLab, GitHub, and also Octoperf when that's released. That all relies on inbound webhooks. The ability to do outbound webhooks is something that is on the SpiraApps, like roadmap, so that a Spira app could have an outbound webhook. Once that's done, then the answer will be yes, but currently that is not possible.
Okay, I think that addressed the majority of the questions that pertain to this presentation. Any other questions? Oh, looks like two more came in at the moment. Oh, we're just getting some thank yous from both Mike and Remco. They're excited about this new feature and the great explanation that you guys provided today.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much for everyone for attending. Just to wrap things up, first of all, thanks Simon and Teresa for being co-host and moderator respectively. Thank you, the attendees, for showing up and listening to us. We will be putting a recording of this on our YouTube channel, and we will have some future webinars coming up on Rupees. I forget which version, I think it's 7.3 we have a webinar coming up from. And we do have, again, more exciting features coming up on Spira, both in SpiraApps and beyond. Go to the roadmap on Spira Docs and see what's coming. Lots of exciting, cool things. Otherwise, have a great morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are, and we'll see you in a future webinar.